The University of Cambridge has been around for many years, about 800 years we reckon now, so actually even older than the university here in Aberdeen, which is of course a distinguished and ancient university. We've actually been involved in computers, well, not for all 800 years, but for a lot of that time, and particularly the work of Charles Babbage was important, who of course designed the difference engine, a successful machine for printing tables of numerical figures for ballistics and the like, and also later went on to design the analytical engine, which was very nearly a computer. It had all the features that we'd now recognise in a computer. It had memory, it had an arithmetic unit, it could execute conditional branches, and it even had a sort of microcode that allowed it to do multiplication, but for various reasons, mainly political rather than technical, it was never completed. And Turing at Cambridge, they both read the maths tripos. They were indistinguishable in their mathematical skills in the eyes of the examiners, both got the highest honours in that degree. And while Turing went over to America, Maurice Wilks stayed in Cambridge, did a PhD in physics, and then was appointed, in fact, in the maths department to set up what was called the Mathematical Laboratory, which is the organisation now known as the Computer Laboratory, and it was essentially a place to do calculations to support scientific research. And in those days this was done using mechanical calculators. This is young Maurice Wilks standing at the back here. And these were things that could solve differential equations essentially in an analog way by linking various mechanical parts together. And there were computers, but the computers were actually the people who operated these machines. Well, the Second World War intervened, and after the Second World War, Maurice Wilks came back to Cambridge, and he'd worked on radar and electronics, and realised that, read about the work in America, the von Neumann report and the summer schools there, the Moore School, about the idea of a stored program computer, and thought it would be fun to build one. And as an electronic engineer, he was pretty confident he could build one using, as a memory technology, something that he'd seen in his work on radar, which was essentially long tubes filled with mercury with a train of ultrasonic pulses running along them. And it turns out in a tube about 5 feet long, 1.5 meters long, you can store about 1,000 ultrasonic pulses, so 1,000 bits of memory, and then you pick it up, receive it, amplify it, put it back in through a transducer, and it travels along the mercury. It's a slightly awkward system, but it does at least store information. And he built a computer around this, and in May 1949, it actually ran a program that was fed in on paper tape in symbolic form, assembled, run, and it printed out on a teleprinter a table of squares of the integers from 0 to 99. Not a terrifically ambitious program, but it means that this is what we would like to think of as the world's first practical electronic stored program computer. Put rather a lot of adjectives in front of the word computer for that to become true. Of course, there were calculating machines previously, electronic calculators in America like the ENIAC, or the Colossus machine at Bletchley. And it was even an electronic computer a year earlier in Manchester, but it only had 8 words of memory, so it wasn't something that could be used for other calculations. Whereas the EDSAC was a complete operational machine that could, well, indeed was, rapidly used by people in other subjects. And within about 3 years of it coming into operation, it had been used for work that led to 3 Nobel Prizes. For boys, for work on chemistry, for work by Kendrew on molecular biology, and work by Ryle on radio astronomy. So it was a very influential computer, which is all the more remarkable when you see how fast it ran. 650 instructions per second. Your mobile phone is 1,000,000 times faster than that. It had about 2,000 bytes of memory, so your mobile phone has about 1,000,000 times more memory. Input and output was on mechanical media, paper tape input, printed output. It filled a room 4 meters by 3 meters, so a mobile phone is rather more than 1,000,000 times smaller, It only had 3,000 valves, effectively transistors in it, so your mobile phone has probably 1,000 million times as many transistors in it, and it consumed 12 kilowatts of power, so your mobile phone probably runs on a millionth of the power. So it was a rather clunky machine, but as I say, it was extraordinarily influential, and if you're patient, sometime later this year, with luck, a replica of it will actually be running at Bletchley Park in the Computing Museum there, so it'll actually be possible to go along and take your paper tape and put it in the paper tape reader and see how long it takes to calculate a table of squares. Incidentally, a program to calculate the squares of the first 99 integers took 2 minutes and 37 seconds, so it wasn't a fast computer. 650 instructions per second is not fast, but it was the move from mechanical calculators to this machine, it's about 1,000 times faster than the mechanical calculators, is the biggest jump we've ever seen in computing. Since then, going from these valves, vacuum tubes to transistors, or transistors to integrated circuits, or integrated circuits to multiprocessors, they're all incremental changes by comparison. But there's still plenty of challenges, and we've now moved from the rather old building you saw previously to a nice new building that we have on the university's West Cambridge site. Courtesy of the nice Mr. Gates, gave us a new building, which is very pretty. It's opposite the vet school, so we actually have animals, horses, wandering around the paddock opposite us. In there we still do a lot of interesting computer science. In fact, we do really quite a lot. We have 45 academic staff now, a lot of research staff, twice as many research staff as academics, and 3 times as many graduate research students working for PhDs. And we work in, well, lots of areas of computing, which sort of broadly we like to think of as how can we use computers for the future of the planet. So that's things like making sure that computers are sustainable. Can we actually reduce their power consumption? Can we use them to monitor power consumption and inform our understanding of energy? Can we make them more reliable? That involves a lot of mathematical theory, perhaps drawing on the work of Turing, who was a theoretician, who wasn't really a great practical computer scientist. And also making them more usable, which is the sort of thing I'm interested in, graphics and interaction. And there are various overlaps, a lot of work in the core areas of systems still. And so it's actually in the area of computer technology applied to interaction that my group is interested. And one of the things that interests us is emotions, which may seem odd. Computer scientists aren't famed for their emotional awareness. You know, the extrovert computer scientist is one who looks at your feet rather than his own when he's talking to you. What have emotions got to do with computers? Well, I'm interested in communications between people and machines, and one way to learn about that is to study how people communicate with other people. And one of the things that we do there is actually look at each other's faces and observe from the person's facial expression what they're thinking. You form your own model of what the other person is thinking. Are they interested or bored, confused or understanding? And you change the way you're presenting things accordingly. Well, it's an important part of social communication between humans, and people who can't do it are at a social disadvantage. It's people with autism spectrum conditions, and they're at a social disadvantage. And in that sense, computers are autistic. Can we do something about it? And to think about this, we need to have a sort of cursory look at some of the psychology that underpins this. And the work on this also goes back to work in Cambridge by Charles Darwin back in the later 19th century, who, about 10 years after he published his book on the origin of species, was interested in whether there was a universal language of expression of emotions through faces. And he did various experiments using photographs from his colleague Guillaume Duchesne de Boulogne in Paris to see if people perceived the same emotions in these pictures of different facial expressions. Because if these were universally understood, that would be a supporting idea for these being conferring some sort of evolutionary advantage, if you could have these unspoken signalling means. And he wrote a book about this, which I say came out about 10 years after The Origin of Species, and interesting for essentially a scientific text. It sold out entirely within 2 weeks. Darwin was a very popular writer. But his photographs were interesting. The way he did his experiments was to collect these photographs. Here are 10 of the samples of Duchenne's photographs, and these are each about A3 in size. We actually have Darwin's set of these photographs in the University Library in Cambridge, which is rather fun. And Darwin then tried to crowdsource opinions as to what the expressions were shown in these photographs. Crowdsourcing was a bit different in those days. You didn't put them on the internet because there wasn't one. But what he did do was invite people round for dinner, and over drinks before dinner he'd pass round the photographs and say, "What expression do you think this is?" And he put the results into a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheets we also have in the University Library. They're big sheets of paper, and across the top are the numbers of the photographs, and down the side are the names of the guests, and he fills in what expressions different people perceived in the photographs, and saw that there was a general consensus view. And in fact, they're the labels in the top row under each of these pictures. Well, we repeated this experiment a couple of years ago using modern crowdsourcing techniques. So we actually digitized Duchenne's photographs, put them on the internet, and without having to invite people round for dinner, we got something like 50,000 people to assess them, and we actually saw whether they had a similar impression. And the answer was these still are relatively universal, so there was a consensus view as to what was expressed in the pictures, and also they were pretty similar to the ones from 130 years earlier. So it would appear that this understanding is actually a real thing, and it persists today. And it hasn't, our interpretation hasn't changed. The words have changed a bit, but the ideas haven't. And in fact, Darwin narrowed down his understanding of emotions to 6 or 7 different categories of emotion. And these are actually things that probably are important for survival. And those of you who are Disney fans will be aware of the ideas of at least 5 of these 6 emotions. So anger, disgust, joy, fear, and sadness were all things that Darwin studied. It has to be said, the 6th one that Disney omitted that Darwin studied was surprise. Apparently there are no surprises in Disney films. And so this is actually quite a rich language, but these are very powerful emotions, very strong. You can detect them from a still photograph, for example, and they're obviously important for survival, but maybe not so common in everyday experience. And if we go to everyday experience, we see a much richer vocabulary of emotions. So the photographs here actually show an actress, a Hollywood starlet called Florence Lawrence, who in 1909 was a major starlet. She was the Biograph girl, and she was making 3 feature films a week, a level of productivity that you don't see in Hollywood nowadays. Now, I should say it wasn't quite as hard as it sounds, because of course a film in those days only lasted 20 minutes, because that was as much as you could fit on a roll of film, and they were silent, so she didn't have to learn her words, and so she could churn these things out. And her particular characteristic, which this advertising handout is meant to display, is her ability to convey emotions through facial expressions. And there's an interesting thing here. There are lots of emotions that she can do, anguish and whatever, but the image at the top left is called piety, so she can look pious, and the one at the bottom right is called sadness, she can look sad. And I reckon these are indistinguishable. So this probably says something, well, maybe, about the morals of Hollywood actresses, even in 1909, that piety and sadness go together. Or there's something more subtle going on here, and actually you can't really recognise these from still pictures. And these slightly more sophisticated emotions, mental states, to do with what you're thinking. So sadness is a pretty visceral emotion, but piety is perhaps a more cognitive mental state. And that perhaps for computing purposes, the ones that should interest us are these cognitive mental states. Things like understanding and confused, interested and bored, or whatever. So the face can convey both the basic emotions that Darwin and Disney are interested in, but also these complex mental states. And the complex mental states might be the more interesting ones. Well, in Cambridge, a colleague, Simon Baron Cohen, who runs the Autism Research Centre, and he's very interested in the pathology that is associated with autism, and also in interventions that may help children with high-functioning autism learn about emotions. And one of the things that he's done for this is to build a new catalogue, lexicon of emotions. And this has a whole 400 mental states rather than 5, 6 or 7. And these are very subtly nuanced, so they've been gathered into a couple of dozen groups. And these groups consist of, well, firstly the 6 basic emotions that Darwin studied, but also 18 groups that are the more subtle mental states that reflect cognitive mental states. And as a teaching aid for high-functioning autistic children, he collected videos of actors acting these different mental states. And so for each of the 400, he got 6 or more videos and found 6 that could be agreed as being a good representation by at least 8 members of a panel of 10 experts. So this is really good data. And what's interesting then is he had some success of using this as a training aid, although perhaps not huge success, for which there are interesting scientific reasons, which we might come back to later. But it meant that this data is available and can be used for other scientific purposes and for experiments. So we did an experiment to see these video clips are actually quite short. They're about 6 to 10 seconds each. So one question is, how much of that video, how long a piece of video do you need to watch before you can form a reasonable assessment of what the mental state is? And so we did an experiment. We took the videos and chopped them up so that we either had the whole video or just the last 4/5 or the last 3/5 or the last 2/5 or the last 1/5, effectively a still picture. So then, depending on how long you showed, you show just the last 5th or 2/5, 3/5, 4/5, or the whole movie, we get different recognition rates. We see that if we ask people to do a forced choice, so we show them 4 choices, one of which is correct and 3 of which are foils that are related but not what we were looking for, we see that for the basic emotions, the ones that Darwin studied, we see a constant recognition rate at about 3/4, 75% maybe. And that's about as good as people are at recognizing these emotions. These things aren't absolute in any sense. We have to sort of understand there'll always be some variance of understanding. But the interesting thing is, for the complex mental states, we see that the understanding increases and the recognition rate increases as we move up to about 2 seconds of video, and then it levels off. And so that suggests that there's something in the human processing of these videos that actually requires a couple of seconds of video evidence before you can form an opinion. And so actually, using still pictures is probably not the best way to set about it. You actually have to use computer systems that can analyse the dynamics of the video. So my student, Rana Kalyubi, did such a thing and put together a system that essentially you point a webcam at somebody's face and we then track features on the face and produce interpretations of what's being seen. So we can actually try that now. I'll show you one of the videos. Here's one of the videos from the mind-reading DVD, the DVD that Simon Baron Cohen produced. And I'll show it to you again in a moment. And then I'm going to invite you in this another crowdsourced experiment to say what you think the emotion is that she's trying to express. Is it agreement, concentration, disagreement, interest, thinking, or unsure? She's unsure, not you're unsure. You're going to have to choose one of them. So let's watch it again. So who thinks she was showing agreement? This is a really bad way of doing science, by the way, asking people to stick atoms. It's just rubbish, but we'll do it nevertheless. Who thinks she was, that was no one I saw there, who thinks she was concentrating? No. Disagreeing? No. In a larger audience, we'll get a few people spotting all of these, incidentally. Who thinks she was showing interest? No, still none. Who thinks she was thinking? Okay, about 4 of you. Who thinks she was unsure? Presumably the rest of you, a large majority. Okay, that's very interesting. Usually I'll get little outliers for the first 3, slightly more for interest, and about equal thinking and unsure. You were definitely a majority for unsure. And the answer is, well, technically this was a video that was labelled as brooding, but it was part of a high-level group called thinking, and which is actually different from unsure. So in some sense, thinking was the right answer. And if we watch the probabilities that are emitted as inferences from the analysis of this, what we see is the yellow trace is thinking, which is sort of running through most of it. The unsure was also coming in at a very high probability, but possibly trailed off slightly earlier at the end of the video. Disagreement was the purple, that there was some sense of at the beginning, but then fades away. Concentrating has a little peak at the end there, and agreement and so on. But if the system were making an inference, we'd probably look for the curve with the largest area under it, which would be yellow, which was thinking. But as you can see, it's pretty hard to distinguish unsure and thinking, and indeed they're words that mean very similar things. So in fact, this system overall, we can see how it works. This is a confusion matrix, and what we see is the across the horizontal axis here are the labels on the videos: agreeing, concentrating, disagreeing, interested, thinking, and unsure, and receding into the distance the inferences. And what you see is firstly a very strong diagonal, which is encouraging, and particularly good recognition rates for things like disagreeing here at over 80%, with various others as the other 20%. And the weakest is actually thinking, is the one that the system is least good at recognizing, at only about 65%. And it's interesting then to see what the confusions are. A video labelled as thinking was being interpreted as concentrating, interested, or unsure, which of course were pretty reasonable alternatives. So this sort of shows that you can do this sort of automatic analysis, but you've got to be very careful how you use it, because the results that you get back are not clean-cut binary answers. They are just suggestions, probabilities, and there are other probabilities, and indeed different interpretations that people might make of what they're seeing. So it's perhaps worth thinking a bit about other ways that we can describe emotions. There's another language that's been developed by Russell, which is to say we take all these words for different emotions and try and spread them out so that words that have similar meanings are close together, and words that have diametrically opposite meanings are, well, on the opposite side of this two-dimensional graph. You do something a bit like a principal component analysis, and the two major axes that you get are activation, so from passive up to active, so these are sleepy and things like that at the bottom here, and things like excited at the top, so it's sort of the amount of energy being expressed in the emotion. And the horizontal axis is valence, so from sad, gloomy and depressed on the left-hand side, through to happy, satisfied, content on the right-hand side. And you can sort of spread the emotions out over these two dimensions. And this is quite a popular measurement with computer scientists, because it looks like you're getting coordinates for each mental state. Actually, it doesn't really work that well, but it's one way of thinking of it. And this is quite a useful hint, because particularly the valence axis from sad to happy is something that's very apparent in a face, and it's quite useful information to know. Is this person, generally speaking, enjoying what's happening to them? So you could sort of imagine, if you're testing a piece of software, you could monitor their facial expressions and see whether they're enjoying the user interface that you're inflicting on them or not. Or if they're looking online at, to do some shopping, are they interested in the products they're being shown or not? And you could then modify which other products you showed them accordingly. So this is a reasonable system. The trouble is, you get many more axes coming out, so there are other ones like potency, from weak to strong, tendencies, inward or outward. It all gets a bit complicated, but these two axes pick up over half the variance that you spot in people's understanding of mental states. So we put together another facial analyzer that uses this model for emotions, as well as the discrete model of words. And this is, roughly speaking, how it works. We start with a webcam pointed at the face, as before. We then have to identify landmarks in the face, things like the edges of the eyes, the outline of the mouth, the outline of the face, for that matter. And we can then do an analysis, and it's all very abstract analysis. Essentially, we just divide the face up into patches, and for each patch we look at the change in illumination across a very small patch, something called a histogram of oriented gradients. These are sort of the appearance features, and you get a huge multi-dimensional description of what's happening in the image, and then use various dimensionality reduction techniques, principal component analysis mainly, and then machine learning techniques, and it's mainly support vector machines to sort of tease apart what's going on, different patterns that you will see in different mental states, and support vector regression to pull out the continuous variance on things like valence and arousal. And from those we can infer things called action units, which is a language that's been used by psychologists for some time to annotate videos. So it's essentially a description of the muscles sort of moving in the face, but we're just sort of pulling those out from this rather abstract description, rather than actually trying to identify their effects on movements in the face. And we can actually see this running. So here's Tanis Bartrositis, another of my research students who developed this system. You see the webcam, some diagnostic. You can see the points that we're picking up around the face, illuminated in yellow. We then normalize the face, so even if he turns his head, we put it square onto the camera, and we have these dynamic histograms. The bar charts here are showing you the strength of various action units. So if we show that again, well, maybe. You can see that this is a brow being raised here and a chin being raised here. These are the lips parting here and so on. These various actions that can then be used to infer discrete mental states here, so neutral most of the time and occasionally angry or surprised. And here you see a trace moving around this two-dimensional valence arousal space. And this gives us a way of monitoring. It's a bit hard to measure the accuracy of something like this because we don't have a good ground truth in the same way that we do for the the videos on the Autism Research Centre's DVD. But essentially we can measure correlation coefficients, and we're explaining over half the variance that we're seeing in the images in the interpretations that we're giving, which is, again, quite a good figure. It's sort of competitive with other systems that other people have developed.
Could I just ask a question on that previous slide? It was the one where you had all the vertical bars on the bottom.
Yes.
That's right, yes. I'd sort of guessed that some of these emotions would mean a sequence of states. In other words, your cheek moved, then your eyes, then something happened, then your eyes moved back again, rather than a kind of vector of of these things.
Correct, yes. So that's to do with the inferences that we're making on one time having this little bit of history, because they do develop over a couple of seconds.
Yes.
And the way we're doing that here is by retaining the previous inferences as encapsulating that history and including that in the inference of the next state.
Okay, right.
But
It's
yes,
just
there
the
are-
way the
there are more
display
elaborate
goes.
ways you could tackle it, certainly.
Make you sort of think, oh, he's taking a vector of readings, and that's what he's using, rather than a statement. And maybe some emotions suit themselves better to a sequence of states rather than a vector in a description.
Well, sorry, the sequence is a vector in time, if that's what you mean. Yes,
Yes, but
yes,
a vector in time as against a vector in different types of
well, so we have the different action units at different times, and analysing the sequence of those. So another technique that we've used for one of our earlier analyses actually used dynamic Bayesian networks, which is a way of doing precisely that. So essentially you track feature points. This was a sort of a more empirical way of doing things, so where you actually, from the movement of the feature points, make interpretations about muscle movements which correspond to the action unit. So, for example, an action unit might be head up and another one might be head down, and you can infer those from movements of the feature points. And then from those, we infer displays which are sequences of those actions. And so this is actually using a hidden Markov model over time. So a sequence of head up, head down is a nodding gesture. And then to actually infer the mental states, we use the current gesture that's just been detected. And we're detecting gestures over a period of about 1 second. And the mental state inference uses a window that includes the previous inferences going back 2 seconds, but also the current gestures, combines those in a probabilistic way. I mean, it's all Bayes' theorem when it comes down to it, and combines those. So, these are various ways that you can analyse facial expressions, but what about other modes? People express their emotions through other things, through the non-verbal components of speech. So things like the energy, the tempo, the pitch can all convey something. Body posture and gesture, movements of hands, movement of body are interesting. And for that matter, can we use the same techniques that we've used to analyse, can we sort of run them backwards and use them to generate animations that actually have emotional content? And the answer to most of these is yes, but it's very much work in progress. So let's think about voice. Voice is interesting because the facial expression, we found we could train on one set of data, and it really generalizes very well to other people. You can identify these features in the face, they're expressed in all faces, for first approximation, and you can identify the features, and that leads you almost directly to the mental states. The trouble with voice is it's a much richer signaling system. There are many, many more dimensions, and trying to work out which ones are characteristic of which mental states is much harder. But what we found we could do was, given 2 different categories of mental state that we were trying to separate, we could identify some characteristics that would allow us to separate them reasonably well. So we could see whether you were confused or interested, or confused or surprised. We could separate any 2 different mental states, and we'd need a different set of characteristics, 2 or 3 signals that we've derived from the audio that would allow us to separate them. So what we do, in order to separate, say, n different classes of emotion, we actually do the half n times n minus 1 pairwise comparisons, which we can do very quickly, and then treat each of those as if they were votes in some sort of preference voting system. And so as a result, from this set of pairwise decisions, we can combine them to give a direct inference. We can either have a single winner or multiple winners. Just think of how election systems work. And that actually gives you quite interesting results. So top left, we see what happens if we have a single winner. This is a system with 9 different categories that we're trying to separate. And again, you see a fairly good diagonal, but quite a few off diagonal here. So for example, excitement was being interpreted as joy or stress, of certainty, various other things. Or we can actually say, well, we'll have several winners. Any label that's won more than half of its pairwise votes will count as being present. So this actually allows us to detect simultaneously occurring different mental states, which of course happens. You can get angry and surprised at the same time. This gives us a much better diagonal, and of course, many more off-diagonal values. In this case, the sum along each of these columns in the table is 1, whereas here we're actually doing multiple inferences simultaneously. But that's probably a realistic way of doing things. So this actually allows us to separate mental states quite well from audio. And again, the interesting thing about this is it turns out to be fairly universal. That is, we can train this on one voice and it will analyse another voice accurately, and indeed we train it on one language and it will analyse other languages effectively. Well, we have a rather limited experience of that. The student who was doing this was actually an Israeli, and she trained her system on English speaking and then tested it on Hebrew, and it was making correct inferences. The advantage of Hebrew, of course, is a very expressive intonation typically of Israeli, so you actually get lots of information to work on. What about...
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
How long were the speech segments? Were they single words or whole sentences? Or?
This was working on quite short clips, so sort of 3 to 5 seconds.
Okay, so a couple of words.
But again, the same thing, you just run continuously, rather like we can do continuous analysis of facial expressions, and you just get continuously varying outputs. We've done another analysis using the dimensional variance for this, where we're actually updating the inferences 6 times a second.
Thinking that in some languages, in particular English, the end of the sentence is very important.
Yes.
Rising or falling intonation.
In terms of giving the mental state that's being conveyed, yes. So we'd actually see that as a burst at the end rather than through the whole sentence.
Okay. Yet in Australian English, it's different.
Well, everything's a question, yes. Yes.
So I didn't say that, but...
what else could we use this for? Well, face and gesture. So here are some faces of tennis players, and it's an interesting question as to whether they're showing joy or despair. You could convince yourself that it's either, and it's pretty hard to tell which are which. But if you look at their hand gestures, it becomes very apparent. So the open hand gesture of a palm is typically despair, oh no, it's gone wrong, and the clenched fist is of joy, yes, I've done it. So there's actually more information that we ought to be analysing, not just the face. We need to look at the body posture and the body gestures. And unfortunately, this is, at least when we were doing this work, first some 10 years ago, it was rather harder to monitor someone's body posture. It involved dressing up in a rather attractive leotard with reflective dots over it. And then we had a motion capture system of the sort that's used in film studios, which tracks all of these dots in real time, and from that we can make inferences about your joint angles and then analyse those. So using a system like that, in fact some colleagues in Glasgow recorded a database of various people acting out 4 different activities. So these were knocking, which you see here, lifting, throwing and walking. and doing them in 4 different emotional states. A neutral, and then angry, happy, and sad. And in fact, if we watch at these again, you can perhaps see that the one on the left has a rather more energy to it, and the one on the right is a little bit more timid. And these are indeed, this is an angry knock, and this is a sad knock. And the question is then, can we actually make an inference about which emotion is being conveyed in these actions? And this turns out to be a lot harder than either face or voice. Primarily because if you just do the obvious thing and analyse the joint angles of their derivatives, which tell you something about the speed of movement, and their second derivatives, which tells you something about the force going into it, the accelerations, what you actually find out, if you just do a naive analysis, is what the person's doing. So you discover whether they're knocking, lifting, throwing, or walking. So what you have to do is to sort of break the motion down into small segments, a bit like phonemes in speech. So you look for low energy points and break the sequence of motions at low energy points. So you then look at each little movement between low energy points. So for example, the knocking action would involve a raising of the hand, and then it's stationary for it, then a strike, stationary, retract, stationary, strike, retract, and then eventually drop. So you've got those 4 different phases with several strike retracts in the middle. And if you break at the low energy points, you can factor out what it is that the person's doing and concentrate on how they're doing it. Except you don't. What you actually find then is who is doing it, because it turns out that different people have very different motion signatures. Some people are just generally more energetic than others. And so you have to actually, unlike face and voice, this you actually have to acclimatise, train to an individual before you can make the inference. So you have to subtract out the person's average performance, and then you can classify the way in which they're doing it. And we see here how if we move from an unsegmented version where we're just taking the whole video on a 4-way choice, we're getting less than 50% recognition rates, which is low even by the standards of this. But if we factor out the individual, or adapt to the individual, and also do the segmentation, we can actually get up to a rather better recognition rate. So we can analyse this, and of course nowadays with things like the Kinect, you can actually monitor people's gestures and posture rather more easily than we could when we did this work. But one of the things that's interested us in a lot of our videos, we find that we have people with hands over their faces. So one thing we've been looking at is how do you cope with a hand over the face? Because the hand over the face actually is quite common, we discovered, in everyday communication. But of course it rather upsets our face tracking because we can't see the feature points. But there again, it conveys information. There is actually a general understanding of what different hand positions over the face mean. So another of my students, Marwa Mahmood, has been working on ways in which we can actually identify where the hand is over the face. This is really hard because it's the same, if you don't have a beard, it's the same colour, same texture as the skin underneath, so actually separating the hand from the face is really hard. And then these different positions of the hand over the face actually give us some information about the mental states that turn out to have fairly general understanding. Again, we've done crowdsourced studies showing videos that we collected of people holding hands over their faces in different ways, and we see that there is actually a fairly common language for those. And indeed, you can even do experiments where we take videos and then separate apart the facial expression and the head posture. So what you see is the video at the top has now been automatically separated. By tracking where the face is, we then re-rotate it, and we get the facial expression straight on, which is the way we do the facial analysis. But we also have separate information about the head orientation and pose, but with no facial expression. And you can then show these to people, and see the difference in recognition rates. And for some expressions, you pick it up just from the face, and from some from the head pose alone, and some you need both. So again, this was an interesting experiment. We actually learned something using our tools about the way that people understand these mental states and these expressions, and we need to analyse both head pose and the actual detail of the facial expressions. Well, I also said we can use this to display mental states on animated objects. So this is Laurel, she's real, and these are various robots. And robots are becoming more common around us, and until recently robots have been separated well, there's only been two sorts of robots. So the ones that work in factories that are very powerful, but have to be behind a safety fence because they'll not notice that you're there and will kill you. And they're the ones that we have at home, which are things like automatic vacuum cleaners, which aren't really powerful enough to be of much use. But we're getting to the point where we're going to have service robots that probably are strong enough to be useful in domestic contexts. And how we communicate with these is going to be an important issue. So, for example, you might imagine a medical robot. This is somebody's impression of what a medical robot might look like. It's a sort of Segway scooter with a television set on the top of it. And this will come racing up when you've collapsed in the shopping mall. I have to say, if I've just had a heart attack, I'm not entirely sure that I'd want a television set on two wheels approaching me like that. I think that may not make me totally confident. So the interesting question is, what would make me confident? And you can imagine in a domestic care situation, you might have a person living at home who has a healthcare professional visiting, and the healthcare professional wants to lift them or move them, but needs assistance, and the assistance might be coming from a service robot of some sort. So we have an interesting three-way communication here. There's a patient, there's a professional, and there's a robot. And each of these will be signalling in some way through facial expressions to the others. So it's going to be important that the healthcare professional and the robot can read the patient's face. It's equally, it's going to be important that the robot can display empathy in its face, or maybe not. So we wanted to do some experiments to see, do people empathize with robots differently depending on their facial expressions? And for this we got made a very high fidelity robotic head. Here you see it cut open. It's got quite good prosthetics on the front of it. It does look surprisingly human, and inside there are a couple of dozen motors that replicate the major muscle groups inside the face, so we can actually show quite a lot of faces on this, and it can display different facial expressions. And we've used this for experiments to see if people enjoy talking to it. And the answer is, actually they find it rather creepy, because the facial expressions, when they're still, are good, but the dynamics are wrong. And people are incredibly good at interpreting these. The way we have been designed as people, we are very sensitive to these facial expressions, and we see things that are unnatural in them, in the dynamics of them. So whilst these still pictures are probably quite convincing, if you watch this robot in motion, it's actually just a bit creepy. Which is an interesting lesson in itself. We did nevertheless manage to do some useful work with it. The robot's called Charles, by the way. The face is modelled on Charles Babbage, not Charles Darwin, and it's actually quite a good replica of Charles Babbage.
So he had very strong eyebrows, because that's the thing that strikes me about it. And the interesting experiment we did with this was we were trying to train medical students to work with a particular class of patient with a condition called dystonia, which causes uncontrollable spasms in the facial muscles. It's very disconcerting when you see it. And it's important that when a medical professional meets such a person, they don't show their natural disgust at this strangely moving face. And what we found was this robot's really good at doing unnatural spasms in its muscle movements. That was easy to program. And so we could actually condition
the medical students to have a conversation with the robot while its face was doing this, and they just got used to it and learned how to ignore it. And we could then take medical students who had been trained in this way and some who hadn't, and monitor them as they interacted with real patients for the first time, and monitor the students, medical students' faces to see if they expressed disgust. And we actually found that this was a quite useful training tool. Admittedly, watching videos is probably about as good as a training tool, so I'm not particularly recommending that we put robots into all the medical schools, but it was an interesting experiment nevertheless. So perhaps I'll just finish by just saying a little bit about some of the applications of these sort of technologies. And there are all sorts of things. I've mentioned some, so monitoring people while you're testing new user interfaces, things like online shopping, online teaching systems, things like service robotics. Actually, we've done, one of my students who's now working at MIT has done some work on making an assistive tool for children with autism spectrum conditions. So you can imagine something like Google Glasses that monitors the face of the person you're talking to, analyses it, and tells you if they're expressing an emotion that you yourself are not recognizing. And one of the areas that's interested us is trying to monitor operators in command and control situations. We were thinking of things like air traffic control and the emergency services control rooms. We did spend some time studying air traffic control. It turns out air traffic controllers don't do emotions. They're incredibly well disciplined and trained, and it's actually not a very good area to try and study. It's just very reassuring. It's actually very safe. But there is another example of command and control that is perhaps more relevant, and that's monitoring drivers, car drivers. Driving a car nowadays is getting to be hard work. The roads are busier, the cars are getting increasingly complicated, they've got all sorts of telematic systems. And if you're lost in an unfamiliar city centre, you're late for a meeting, there's lots of traffic, the last thing you want is a satellite navigation system that tells you to make a U-turn. It's going to cause an accident. What you want is one that realises that you're confused and concentrating and actually helps you. So certainly stops your mobile phone from ringing, maybe turns off the radio so you don't have that distraction, maybe even lets you drive in the wrong direction for a bit until you recover your composure, and then you can sort of come back in and have another go. So we've been doing some work with monitoring drivers. And we did some early studies in my student runner Al Kalyubi again, who did a study in Cairo, where she, Cairo traffic, by the way, is busy. And she just balanced a webcam, a video recorder on the dashboard of her car and deliberately got lost and then tried to find her way back. And what you see is a whole load of different mental states over the period of the video, but quite a lot of the blue, which was uncertainty, and of the green, which was bothered. And so maybe there was something in this. But the trouble is we can't do experiments by sending people out into the traffic and monitoring them, because we don't know enough about the environment. We need to be able to have controlled conditions that we can experiment on. So we looked into the possibility of building a driving simulator, and it turns out you can. You can buy quite expensive software for driving simulators that's used by the car companies. But it turns out actually it's not very good. It's got lousy graphics, you get very bad telemetry about where the car is being driven. You can't control the other traffic, it's only got a very small map. And so then we hit on the idea that actually there's a better way of doing that. And for various reasons this video shows me driving with the robot next to me, but the answer is Grand Theft Auto. Grand Theft Auto costs 1/100th of the price. It has really good graphics, it has very good telemetry if you know where to look for it. You can find exactly where the person's driven. You can control what the other cars on the road are doing, and indeed the weather conditions, and it's got large maps. So we've done a lot of experiments making people drive around San Andreas in Grand Theft Auto. And at the same time we could make the other cars aggressive, we could do all sorts of experiments, change the weather, make them do mental arithmetic while they were going. And what we found was that we could make them crash by making them do too much at once, but they didn't care. It just didn't seem to bother them if they had an accident, because they knew it was a simulator. I mean, it's ideal in that we could send lots of people out around the same course, but we couldn't really get a lot of information back because there was no emotional engagement. So then we hit on the idea of getting some of these toy drones that you perhaps have seen. Typically they connect to your mobile phone, and your mobile phone then used to fly them, and they have a camera on them that relays a picture back to the phone. So we got some of these and reprogrammed them slightly so that they sit on the Wi-Fi network in our lab instead, which means that you can then fly them off around the lab, but the pilot is back in our experimental lab, and so we can be monitoring the person who's flying it and measuring their facial expressions and other things like physiology while they go and fly these things around. And this turns out to be really much more emotionally engaging. You hear it going down the corridor, and if you crash into a wall, somebody has to go and pick it up and set it going again. So you actually care whether you have an accident or not. It's also great because you can fly it into your colleagues' offices and really irritate them, but that's just a sort of a byproduct. But scientifically, this turned out to be quite useful. We did some experiments just measuring physiology. So there are two signals from physiology that are often reckoned to be useful indicators of stress, of arousal. One is heart rate, and one is skin conductivity. And so here we see graphs at skin conductivity at the top, heart rate at the bottom. And we see then for two different systems. This is car driving and this is drone flying. And then within each picture we have easy and hard conditions. And you can see there was really very little difference in the driver's response if they were between easy and hard when they were driving the car. But when they were flying the drone, we saw much more significant differences. There was actually an emotional engagement taking place, and that was actually sort of gripping them. And so when we made it hard, they got genuinely worried because they knew they were going to crash the thing. So that beginning to show that we can use this to monitor car driving, and we're doing some trials at the moment on recording a lot of information. This is with real car drivers on real roads, trying to monitor as lots of drivers go around the same circuit, trying to understand which emotions they express at different times. But of course that's much more complicated because we can't control the other traffic. We've also done some work on using this to teach children with high-functioning autism about emotions. These children with high-functioning Asperger's, for example, know that they have a problem and want to do something about it. And so a large European consortium has put together a system where there are lots of adventure games that the children can play. And one of the ways you learn about recognizing emotions is by acting them. And so the children have challenges where they have to act emotions, and then the quality of their acting is monitored using webcams, microphones, and indeed a Kinect to measure body posture and gesture. And we can then analyze that information and give feedback to the child about whether they're acting the emotion well, and indeed even give diagnostics about how they could improve their acting, show them the differences between what they're doing and what the canonical preferred performance would be. And from this they learn. Again, the trials are still in progress to see whether this as an intervention has an effect on the children's ability to understand emotions. And also, Darwin was interested in animals. His book was called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, and it has some rather charming illustrations of a dog here, which is being in an affectionate frame of mind. I think that's actually the dog and cat here are in an affectionate frame of mind, and top left they are prepared to fight. And there are differences, actually a little bit to do with their fur, but also the facial expressions. And so, though we're not terribly interested in dogs and cats, but as I mentioned, we have the veterinary department directly opposite our lab, the other side of the paddock with the horses in. And the vets are very interested in sheep. And so we've been trying to learn about pain in sheep. Actually walking the last few days, I've been studying the sheep that I see carefully, because I'm now moderately good at recognising sheep that have got foot rot. And you see pain in a sheep's face in all sorts of different ways. In their eyes, the partial closure of the eyes, in the cheeks being drawn in the ears sort of folding down, in the lips being not smiling. Sheep really smile when they're happy. And in their nostrils, the angle of the nostrils gets steeper. And so the interesting question is, can we recognise these mental states in sheep from some sort of automatic technique? Could we position a webcam near a feeding trough on a hillside so as the sheep came to feed, we could look at their face and spot these indicators of pain? So the first thing we've had to do is to actually study the ways of recognising a sheep's face. It's the same sort of techniques that we use for recognising the outline of a human face. It's just a different shape, different training data, and essentially we can now pick out various key points on the face, which are near these areas that we then want to analyse, so notably the ears and the eyes and the nostrils. And we've now got a system that can actually recognise these really quite well at an awful lot of different head poses. The trouble with sheep is you can't ask them to look straight on at the camera. Actually, this is work that the student's going to be presenting at a conference in a couple of weeks' time. So we can now begin to recognise where the key indicator points are on the face, and the next thing is to actually try and do some analysis of the face. Well, I'll stop there. I've talked about a very broad area of different things that we need to do with emotion. Talked a bit about the languages of classification. I talked a bit about data collection, getting training databases for machine learning, the need to label these, so actually have labels that you're confident in, that have been put on by people who know what they're doing, and we can then use to train our systems. I've talked about different modes, faces, voice, body, posture and gesture. I've talked a little bit about synthesis with robots. All of this is using a lot of machine learning inference techniques. And then finally I've talked a bit about applications, and that's actually the core to this. This is not the sort of thing that we can just do in the abstract, say, I'll make an emotion recognizer. It's very much something that you take to a particular application, work out what it is you want to identify, and then train a system that can separate the different mental states that might be important. And I suppose I should say, of course, I haven't actually done any of this work. It's all done by a lot of very bright research students and research assistants who are the people who actually do all the work. And we're now going on to great things. Some of them running companies, well, one of them anyway, Rana's running a company that's actually selling this technology for monitoring advertisements on television, or trials of advertisements. They monitor the audience and see whether they enjoy the commercials or not. So at that point, with thanks to these people, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to take questions if you have any.
I was wondering about a lot of the input that you were using are using actors. Yes. So those are people who are pretending to express an emotion. Is that a problem, or how is that handled?
Yes, it is. You're exactly right. That is a problem. So a lot of our training data does come from actors. Certainly the early work on the DVD from the Autism Research Centre. And yes, there is a difference in acted emotions. They tend to be rather clearer. They tend to be slightly more exaggerated, and so yes, they're easier to work with. But we've nevertheless found that if we train a system on acted data, it can recognise naturally evoked data as well. And we have done some experiments collecting naturally evoked data ourselves. So we, in the lab, set up a system where we had people interacting with a computer system and doing it in a hands-free way. So we had a mock-up of a system where you could complete various tasks using voice interaction, or somebody actually in the background doing the typing. And this meant, this was particularly for our database of seeing whether people use their hands if they weren't obliged to put them on the keyboard, did they touch their faces? So this was naturally evoked in the sense that we were making them do a task, and we could then control the task and make things go wrong, and see if we could make them frustrated and so on, or confuse them by setting hard problems or insoluble problems. And we got lots of videos, so this is naturally evoked data, and in fact the facial expressions are the ones that we would expect, but on about a third of the videos there'd be a hand gesture over the face, and that's what we were interested in. Of course, the next question then is, how do you get this labelled? Is there a general understanding of what these hand gestures mean? And the answer is yes, and to do that we did a different sort of crowdsourcing using a game on Facebook. It turns out, get these sort of videos labelled with mental states, you can either hire professional coders to do it for you, or you can make a game on Facebook and get people to play it for you. And it turns out they'll play the game very happily. So there are thousands of people with nothing better than to do than to play games that actually are causing them to label these videos for us. So yes, we do that. And that's a beginning of a collection of naturally evoked data. But it's the problem there is getting accurate labelling, getting enough people to label it and to filter out the people who are just mucking about and so on, which we can do using statistical techniques.
Are there any kind of universal states with corresponding universal face thinking? If you go to New Guinea and find some Stone Age tribe and whatever,
Yes.
do you discover this kind of thing?
That's a very good question. So Darwin investigated this himself. So he actually, he couldn't afford to send people out to express emotions to those tribes, and he couldn't even afford to send the Duchenne photographs around because they were just too valuable. So actually Darwin prepared a questionnaire. Actually, it's a real example of how not to produce a questionnaire. It's the sort of questionnaire that might have come out of a political opinion poll company. It was, do you associate this emotion with this movement of the muscles? And it was leading questions right the way through. And on the basis of that, Darwin concluded that there was a universal language of emotions because people gave the right answers to his questionnaire. Of course, it's an interesting answer. Taking months to get the questionnaire to people and months to get it back. So it's a long-term project. And to be honest, this work was somewhat discredited subsequently. And so for a lot of the early part of the 20th century, people were much less sure about the universality because of Darwin's, frankly, rather poor scientific methods. And it was actually an American psychologist called Paul Ekman who revisited this question in the 60s. And it was Ekman, then using modern photographs, actually did circulate photographs around the world and sent people out into the field, indeed to meet tribes that had never encountered Western civilization. And they could accurately, within what I mean by accuracy in this, distinguish these 6 basic emotions. And this is the language of basic emotions that's very widely used. These were essentially the ones that Darwin studied, similar to the ones that Disney portrayed, only there's also a surprise here. And yes, there is. He found that these were shared even by tribes that had not been exposed to mainstream media, and so these really are something of the human condition in understanding these 6 basic emotions. Now, of course, the complex mental states are probably learned. So some things like nodding can mean disagreement in some cultures, Eastern European and Asian cultures. So there are more complex issues there. But by and large, yes, these are common. And indeed, they're shared with some of the higher primates. So you actually see in some monkeys similar